Hi, this is Stacy Zrien, and welcome to Making Sense, where we address your personal finance questions one at a time. Making Sense is a pure conversation podcast. Listeners can email questions to pureconversationpodcast@gmail.com or tweet them to us at pureconvopod.
This is an opinion-based podcast. A listener sends us the following question. I find myself able to budget really well. Most months of the year, I'm totally fine, even with a small surplus. I have a problem coming short a few months a year during holiday times. What can I do to change this?
So kudos listener. I'm already happy. They've got a budget and sounds like they're making good decisions and finding themselves with that, like they say, a little bit of surplus. And I guess now coming into, holiday season, summer season, there are expenses that come up that perhaps are different than the rest of the year. My suggestion would be very simply to continue that budget for a 12-month period. When we work with clients, the initial budgeting is to do an average of each month. And that's really more of a statement of financial position, if you will. It's really showing people where they stand in a given moment in time. And very often when we do a budget together, we'll do an average month, if you will. I'll take expenses such as camp or a one-time annual fee and divide it over 12. It makes my clients sometimes a little bit wary because they're looking and saying, wait, I don't pay my accountant $21.43 each month. These are obviously costs that get paid through, once a year. But that being said, the next step after that, we do that in order to get an idea of what's coming in and what's going out in a given month. But the ultimate idea is to be able to do that on an annual basis and to have a budget worksheet that has the 12 months of the year in it, so that it accounts also for the cash flow and it becomes not just a personal financial statement of where you stand, but also a cash flow, meaning what's coming in and what's going out on a particular month. On something like that, where you're comparing income for each month against your expenses for each month, will show up hopefully in advance where the shortfalls will be, where those negative numbers might come up. And so if you know that, for example, in July or in June, let's call it, you're going to have a camp payment, or in December or in April, you're going to have extra costs to get through the holiday season. Those are things that you'll be able to plan for in advance, unless, of course, you're starting month one with the deficit, which makes it a little bit trickier, but we'll assume for now that that's not the case, since the caller specifically mentioned that they've had a surplus over several months. And what they would want to do is to be able to account for that and look at their month by month, but also to know ultimately throughout the year what they have and what they'll be able to assign to those different months. Just to illustrate the point further, let's say, for example, there's a $500 surplus in January, February, and March. And then in April, there's a negative of $1,000. Caller would know at that point to anticipate that and put away the $1,500 so that $1,000 can be applied toward April, and hopefully see that the savings are there even over the course of the whole year and not just on a specific month-to-month basis.
I notice for a lot of people, they have trouble sort of planning for intermediate expenses, whether that means, let's say let's just give an example. Someone makes $8,000 a month. Their regular, their budget calls for $7,000 of expense. They have $1,000 in surplus, and they know that 3 or 4 times a year, they need to allot that other amount of money to afford, let's say, a $3,000 very expensive holiday for their family. So what is a good strategy over the month to plan, other months of the years to plan that money? And what's a good way to either, or a good place to keep that money to kind of save it for the right place, instead of keeping it on the bank account where it might be in the standard bank account where it might be very enticing to use right away?
Right. That's a great question. So what I recommend, and I do this specifically with young people, whether they're newlyweds or singles who are either going to work for the first time or setting up accounts for the first time, I actually recommend 3 accounts. a checking account, a savings account, and a charity account. And the checking account is really for money to come into. So when someone is working, that's the account that their monthly paychecks or paycheck should be coming into. The savings account we'll touch in a second. And then the charity account is also for whatever percentage that they wish to tithe or to give to for the month to be able to be moved into that account. But specifically, let's use our same example as before. Let's say we have a person making $8,000 a month. $8,000 comes into the checking account. And that month, their monthly expenses are $6,500, which they know prior to the beginning of the month because they've put together their budget and they're aware of what their costs are going to be. I would recommend at the beginning of the month taking out, or rather as they're paid, taking that $2,000 surplus and moving it into the savings account. This way it doesn't get sort of mixed up with all of the other numbers and all the other spending that goes on during the month on various cards or cash or debit card or whatever it might be, and that they've allotted enough in the account to be able to cover those expenses. Of course, I'm not talking for most cases down to the penny. Things do come up, maybe a few extra dollars here and there, and I'm okay with a little bit of a cushion in case there's something unforeseen. But of course, it's pretty easy to move money between a savings and a checking account. So I like the idea of bringing the money into the checking and then moving whatever is anticipated to be surplus into the savings. Over the course of time, I would then take whatever's in the savings that we know is not going to be needed for the upcoming months and move it into some sort of an investment, assuming that their emergency fund is fully funded. But at least for that amount of time, it removes that chunk of money from their checking account so that it's not lumped together with everything else that they're spending. I want to go back just for one quick second to touch on the charity account. A lot of people that I work with, especially young people and young couples, are dedicated to the idea of charity. And what I like the most about having this special earmarked account is that it allows you to put the money aside without having to use it immediately. Let's say, for example, same example, $8,000 income. Let's say somebody's determined that they're going to give $500 of that money each month to charity. You don't want to have people standing on the street corner waiting to look for people to give out the $500 to. That, in my opinion, and I've asked also some religious opinions on this, it does not have to be given out right away. It has to be earmarked right away. So instead of standing, like I said, on a street corner waiting for poor people or for needy people to pass by who need those funds could be put into the account. And then if they get a call 2 weeks later that says, hey, we're raising money for a particular family or for a particular individual or an organization, they can then say, oh yeah, I have money in the account. Perhaps they even have the buildup of a few months. Perhaps friend is being honored by an organization and they want to give a little bit extra to them. All of a sudden they find themselves in a position where they have those funds set aside. They haven't gotten mixed in or mixed up with the regular monthly spending. So I really like that as a strategy as well. But that's how I would handle that. I would move that into a separate account.
I'd like to add a certain idea. I can't remember where I saw this, but I read a while ago that someone suggested that when you're tracking sort of intermediate expenses, meaning expenses that aren't necessarily for one time, nor are they, let's say, fall within the monthly cycle, a good way of writing things down is say, to add to your list, just like, I spend, a couple $100 in gas, maybe this month a little more with the shortages and everything, but, on a normal month, let's say, gas is $100, car is $300, etc. You might write something that's less often, let's say like clothing or like this holiday expense, but you say, listen, at the end of the year, I know that I'm going to have to spend, let's say, $12,000 on, we'll call them holiday expenses. And I know that means divided evenly, I have to take out $1,000 every month on the side. So when you're planning the budget, it might be a good idea, even though the holidays come, free every few months or whatever, it might be a good idea to divvy it up and say, okay, well, when I'm planning my budget, there's going to be a, besides car, besides heat, besides everything else, there's there's also take into account of my budget this expense. I saw this, I think the specific example is clothing, where like the average person, I think the example is like spends like, $1,200 a year on clothing, but it's usually a few $100s every time, not, $50 a week or whatever. So so a good way of accounting for that is taking out the money on a monthly basis, assuming it's a monthly expense, and then living life as such.
I like that idea a lot. And again, that would work with the savings account, putting that amount into the savings account, and then knowing on a given month if you're going to spend. The clothing's actually almost a better example than the holidays, because at least the holidays, you know when they're going to happen. Clothing, with the exception of maybe kids who are, starting camp or need a uniform, most people don't know that in May they're going to see something that they want to buy, or, find a new dress or a new suit. So I like that idea a lot. And again, the same strategy can be used to take that amount of money each month and put it into the savings account, knowing that as they spend X amount, whatever they've budgeted for the clothing, that money is there for safekeeping.
Very good. Our next question comes from, I'll just give a little context, because I think depending on what kind of person is asking would actually change the answer to this question. But a younger person, let's say just starting off in the workforce, recently married, came up with the following question. I recently received money from my tax returns and stimulus check, which puts me at a large surplus over my budget. What are the best things I could do with this surplus money? And keep in mind, this isn't significant amount of money, but it's certainly a few $100 that I didn't plan before.
So the stimulus checks have been a definite source of blessing and source of unexpected income. And if used properly, they can definitely get you ahead of the game a little bit. Of course, the temptation is and has been, and if you read the studies, a lot of that money is getting spent, which I think was the government's intention also. But if you ask me in a case like that, I go back to those baby steps, if you will. My first question would be, do we have a fully funded emergency fund? Certainly, even prior to that, do we have any debt? Because if somebody's got debt, then that money should be earmarked immediately for debt repayment. Assuming they're debt free, do they have a fully funded emergency fund of 3 to 6 months of expenses in case of an unforeseen circumstance? Maybe next year, God forbid, there's another downturn in the economy and Congress isn't as generous as they were this year. Maybe they're, out of cash too. So I would definitely want to make sure that emergency fund is fully funded. Taking it a step further, what's the next step in that person's, on their agenda? Are they looking to buy a home? Have they started to fund their retirement account? If the answers to both of those are yes, and they want to look at that money and say, hey, we've been really wanting to head to Florida for a weekend or buy ourselves something. If that money is truly extra and over and beyond, there's no reason that money can't be enjoyed also. But I would definitely take the opportunity first to check off all the boxes. Again, in order, starting with any unpaid debts, going to an emergency fund, making sure that there's some retirement funding in place, checking if what the next stage is. Are we looking for a house? Is that money that can be put toward a down payment? Because windfalls, even those small windfalls, are really just able to get you ahead of wherever you were and get you ahead a little more quickly.
I would also add, to be a little more specific, I'm assuming everything else is on track, meaning, let's say they're looking for a new house and they're already planning around that, and any other foreseeable expenses in the next foreseeable years, that's already accounted for. So I would say definitely, you have to make a decision whether or not, do you want a current experience or a future experience? Meaning, do you want to spend yourself on a fancy steak dinner or a weekend away, or do you want to, just have more money and be safer for the long run? I definitely wouldn't recommend, there've been a lot of talk online with people who get stimulus checks, spending a lot of money on some very wild ventures. Most recently, I've seen oil futures. Would not recommend playing with that right away. But I would say that definitely putting money, not just surplus money, not just in a savings account, but in a highly liquid money-making asset. By liquid, I mean ability to cash out and not a humongous risk of losing the money and not a big risk to inflation. So I would potentially say something like like an S&P mutual fund of the sorts or whatever, and just keep it there. So that way, on any regular investment app, you could always sell it if you wanted to right now. But there's no reason, especially right now with, I would say with inflation, everything that's going on, I would highly recommend putting it in a liquid asset instead of keeping it in cash.
I hear that, and I would agree with that wholeheartedly. I also, there's also a human factor, and it doesn't have to be an all or nothing game. Even if it is a few $100s, there's a way to partition that money. Some of it can go to savings, and you can leave a small piece maybe for a little special, current event, as you called it, or a current pleasure, whether it's a small steak dinner. Again, it doesn't have to be the entirety of the check. It can be a small portion, and still responsibly put away, the larger part.
All right, do we have time for another?
Yeah, I'm good.
All right, so here's another. My child was recently bar mitzvahed and received a lot of money as gifts. Being that our family spends a lot of money on our bar mitzvah, I wouldn't say an abnormal amount, but average. We are hoping to use the money to send my son to camp. When I told my son this, he was really upset, and he felt that they were gifts for him, and that just like all his other friends, he should be able to spend it on things he likes, or at least put away to invest for his future. How should we deal with this situation?
So this is a good question, and it's one that definitely got me thinking a little bit. I think, one of the things that we want to pay attention to in a case like this, let's start with the basics. Is it ethically wrong for the parents to take the money? My answer to that would be no. And I would say no for the following reason. Number one, they're not taking it for their own use. They're using it for their child, even if it's on something that maybe he, if given the choice, may not choose. He may say, hey, I don't want to go to camp. I want to save up for a new scooter. But at the end of the day, ethically, the parents are certainly not doing anything wrong. Even to take it a step further, they, if you look at it from their perspective, had they not made the bar mitzvah, the kid probably wouldn't have gotten the gifts. So they had to spend the money to make the money. And therefore, I really do think it is in the parents', it's in their rights, if you will, to use that money for their son, certainly the way that they see fit. But between ethics and a 13-year-old, there's definitely a gap. And I think that the way to handle it is to do it with with a little bit of a tender touch. And rather than, approaching the kid saying, well, we have every right to take this money, and you're going to camp, and perhaps there's a way to take, even if it is a small piece of the gifts, to give that child some control over the funds that have come in. Maybe it's, a gift that came particularly from a grandparent, or something that probably would have come in anyway. Or maybe it's just a small portion, or to ask the child. Again, you're speaking to a 13-year-old, so it's, I take that with a big grain of salt also. But to say, if you did have this money, what would you have in mind to spend it on? And maybe there's a conversation there. Maybe it's done with a little bit more, gentleness than sort of saying, well, ethically, Dad and I are in the right, and we have every right to use this money for your camp. But I think that there are a lot of parents who are in a situation where there are necessities that they know that their child needs. Perhaps the child knows that it's best for them, and perhaps they don't even realize it. But if you've got working parents, then they certainly, then a child certainly needs to be in some form of camp. They're not hanging out at home while mom and dad head off to work. So I think it is definitely within the parents' rights to make a decision like that. Again, I'm stressing the fact that the money is being used. I've had questions where the money was being used for the parents' benefit, not for frivolous benefit, but for necessities. In those cases, all of the parents took a loan, if you will, where they had a promissory note to repay the child at a later date. Some did, some didn't. But certainly in a case like this, where the parents are using the money for the child's benefit, even though they are in the right, I would love to see it done in a way where the child maybe understands, or can, be given some ability to flex his muscle to indicate what he would like, and what maybe there's a happy, maybe not medium, but a little something that he's able to contribute, whether it's a portion for savings. Again, back to our other conversation, it doesn't usually have to be an all or nothing. And even a small amount that the young man is investing, or even a small gift that maybe he had his heart set on, may be enough to make it an equitable division of funds.
What if I tweaked the question a little bit? What if I said the parents said, we spent, a significant amount, maybe even if it's normal, we were, I don't mean this in a negative way, but we are socially obligated to spend, a certain amount of money to make a normal sized bar mitzvah. Maybe what if they said, listen, like we would like the money back to pay it back, otherwise we'd be using the money for other things, not necessarily to keep food on the table, but would you say that's a valid argument at all?
Yeah, it's a question for the ethicist more than the financial planner, because financially it's kind of a wash. If you look at it, I look at the numbers, and I guess the child, if he didn't have a bar mitzvah, wasn't getting any presents per se. And if he does have the bar mitzvah, has a fun party, and if the parents take the gifts to pay, I'd love to, as a parent, I would love to see that conversation happen prior to the bar mitzvah. And in that case, ask the child if this is something that he wants.
I feel really uncomfortable being there.
Yeah, but it's not a financial, I always joke with my coworkers when we meet with a client, we don't joke, but we say, what percentage financial was it? Because we'll meet with families a lot, or singles or individuals, and we'll say, okay, they have a financial issue, and really only about 25% of the issue is financial, and the other 75% is personality or just other factors that affect the situation. And in this case, I think it's more of an ethical question or a parenting question than it is a financial one.
So where should someone turn if they have these sort of questions, if not when they discuss with the financial, meaning there's a financial aspect to it involved with planning and covering costs and whatever, but what would at least be the appropriate way to determine what's appropriate?
Yeah, my personal feeling, I don't love the idea of throwing a party where it's a wash. I kind of feel like a lot of the time that's the parents doing that. And essentially they're inviting they have that in some countries, by the way, where you pay your own plate at a wedding. And you go you're invited as a guest, but you have to, like, there's a minimum cover charge, which is considered the gift to the married couple. And I laugh at that. It's kind of like paying your entrance fee at a club. So parents who are doing that, they're really, I wonder, is the child really the beneficiary of that, or those parents who were looking to make said party? In which case, I don't know if I'm a big fan. A lot of times parents have, they will say that they have trouble expressing to their child that something is, that something is not something that they can't have. But really it's their own insecurity that's coming through. I'll give you an example. I met with a family once, and the mother was asking me questions about remodeling their kitchen. And she said that their kitchen is in such that they don't have the money to do it, but that the kitchen was in such disrepair that she feels uncomfortable, that when her kids want to have friends, they always come home and they'll say, how come our friend's kitchen is so nice? And why can't we do our kitchen, and things like that. And the answer is it depends on how the parent answers. If the parent's answer is, wow, you're right, they do have a great kitchen, and wow, our kitchen is awful, and I think, I wish we could do our kitchen, then that child's going to walk away and feel that lack. They're going to feel that there's something missing in their world, in their home. But if a parent speaks from confidence and can look at the child and say, you're right, they do have a beautiful kitchen and we're so happy for them, but you should be so proud of me and daddy. We both work, we both have jobs, and we love you guys, and we don't want to make decisions that we really can't afford. And you should know that we're making really solid decisions, and you're young still, so you don't understand everything, but you should be proud of the way that we're doing. So obviously it's not a conversation for a 4-year-old, but my guess is the 4-year-old is not complaining about the kitchen. So if a parent can speak to a child with that little bit of confidence, which of course the parent needs to have in order to portray, I think it goes a longer way. So a parent who is interested in making a big party, you don't have to. You become a bar mitzvah by the mere virtual fact of turning 13, with or without said party. So if the parent can look at their child and say, listen, we would love to give you a party like everyone else has, but we just don't think it's the responsible choice. I know of someone else who didn't make a party, and instead they only had a very small budget, and they took the child on a very special trip, which I'm sure is as meaningful to him as the party might have been. And that's a conversation to have. And if you do have a kid who's desperate, who's very social and desperate for the party, maybe you can ask a 13-year-old if they're comfortable with using gift money for the party itself. But again, wonder if that's coming from the kid or the parent.
Exactly. All right, very good. Thank you so much for listening. Make sure to like and subscribe, and feel free to leave a comment on whichever platform you're listening to. Maybe we'll read them on the show one time. If you have a question, we'll definitely try to answer it. And make sure to check out pureconversation.com for more content. Thank you for listening.
Good night.